Today, we're going to talk about Uncle Oscar Laighton. We talk a lot about Oscar's sister, Celia Thaxter, the famous poet of the Isles of Shoals. So today I thought we could devote a bit of time to getting to know Uncle Oscar Laighton better, a beloved figure of the Isles of Shoals. Now, Oscar first went out to the Shoals when he was just 2 months old. His father, Thomas, took a job as the lighthouse keeper out on White Island at the Shoals. And this is the original lighthouse on White Island that was built in the 1820s. And it would have been the lighthouse that Oscar and his family grew to know and love. The Laighton family went out. Thomas, of course, the father, Eliza, Oscar, and Celia's mother. As I mentioned, Oscar was only a couple months old, a babe in arms. And later on, a couple years later, his younger brother Cedric was born. So the family stayed out on White Island, and the children would help their father by going from the keeper's house, which you see on the left, through the covered walkway up to the lighthouse, and they would go to the top and help their father light the oil lanterns, the shiny beacon that guided ships to safety around the shoals. Now, while Thomas was serving as the lighthouse keeper on White Island, he was elected for the second time to the New Hampshire state legislature. So he had to go back to the mainland and give up temporarily his lighthouse keeper job. So he wanted the family to be able to have additional income. And he asked his wife, Eliza, if she would be willing to go over to neighboring Smutty Nose Island at the Isles of Shoals and run a boarding house there, a pre-existing boarding house. Eliza agreed. So Eliza and Celia and Oscar and Cedric went to Smutty Nose Island, and Eliza hosted at the Mid-Ocean House of Entertainment. That does not mean what you think it means. You added entertainment to the name of a hotel or boarding house if there was a tavern on the premises. So Eliza ran the Mid-Ocean House, and she became renowned for her hospitality. Folks particularly enjoyed her fish chowder and donuts. So by now, Oscar, as a child, had lived on 2 of the islands at the Isles of Shoals, both White and Smutty Nose. Thomas finished his term in the legislature and came back out to the Shoals. Thomas Laighton had fallen in love with the Shoals, so he purchased 4 of the islands, including Hog Island, which he renamed Appledore. And on Hog, given Eliza's success running the Mid-Ocean House, on Hog, Thomas built the Grand Appledore House Hotel with 170 rooms that slept 400 people. So Oscar, as a boy, grew up in this hotel, and he talks about having met some famous luminaries there, including Nathaniel Hawthorne, who visited the Shoals a couple times and stayed at Appledore House. And as a boy, Oscar rode Nathaniel Hawthorne around from island to island. And Hawthorne was probably the first of many luminaries that Oscar would meet. Oscar was 16 years old before he visited the mainland at all. He only knew the Shoals, and he knew vistas like this, with very little vegetation, very quiet, very calm, very stark. So when Oscar first went into Portsmouth, it was the first time he had seen a tree or a horse, and evidently he got quite freaked out. This is a photograph of Oscar pictured on the left with his sister Celia and her new husband, Levi Thaxter. Oscar was probably between 16 and 18 in this photograph. So in his youth, he played with his brother and sister on the rocks of Appledore and the other islands at the Shoals. In adulthood and as a young man, he helped his family run the Grand Hotel. Appledore House was sort of the first grand seaside hotel north of Boston, and it became quite successful. When Oscar was in his early 30s, the hotel had a visitor. This is the register for Appledore House. The visitor was a wealthy merchant from Boston named John Poor, who came with his business partner, Stickney, and stayed at Appledore House. John Poor was a partner in the Stickney and Poor Mustard and Spice Emporium out of Boston. And John Poor enjoyed his stay at Appledore House so much that he purchased Star Island and built a grand hotel there, the Oceanic. This is the original Oceanic, put up in 1873. Now, sadly, after only 3 seasons, the original Oceanic burned to the ground. It was November, so there were no guests staying there. It was very early in the morning, between 3 and 4 a.m., and it said that the glow of the flames of the burning Oceanic could be seen from Boston. No one was hurt except a night watchman who jumped from a window and hurt his knee. The rest of the staff was staying at the Atlantic House. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago, John Poor didn't give up. He put together a second Oceanic hotel from some of the existing buildings on Star Island. But after a 4th season running the hotel, John Poor gave up. He first built a pier so that larger boats could arrive on Star Island, the pier that we still use today when we go to Star. And when the Laightons were asked how they felt about Poor having put up this pier so that he could host more and more guests at his hotel, Oscar said, "The tremendous advertising of the Oceanic was bringing new people to Appledore." And that was sort of Oscar's attitude towards life. If the pie was bigger, he got a bigger piece. So he welcomed the competition, but the Laightons did put in their own pier and made some improvements to keep on a par with the Oceanic on Star. As I mentioned, John Poor had it after his 4th season though, and he decided he wasn't a hotelier. So he sold the Oceanic and Star Island to the Laighton family, specifically the Laighton brothers, Oscar and Cedric. Thomas and Eliza, their parents, had died by the late 1870s. So Oscar and Cedric ran both hotels and owned both islands. Quite an endeavor. Oscar himself was quite a romantic. It would seem that he became engaged every summer to a new hotel guest. Many of the girls didn't quite realize they were engaged to Oscar, but he held the bonds very close to his heart. Oscar said, "It seemed to me that the most beautiful girls in the world were visiting Appledore. Every summer I would fall so deeply in love, it would take me all the next winter to come to. Then the returning season, it would happen all over again." And Oscar would write impassioned verses to these women, both in his youth and in his later years. When Oscar Laighton was in his early 40s, he truly fell deeply in love with a woman named Lucy Darby, who was a hotel guest at Appledore House. And Lucy was the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Salem, Massachusetts. And evidently Lucy and Oscar were whooping it up and having such a good time that her father heard about this back in Salem. And he wrote her, cautioning her about entanglements at the Shoals. He had other plans for her. So she went back home and Oscar was distraught. So he and his sister Celia went to Europe. This was in 1880. And Celia reported in many of her letters back to the States that Oscar would just sit in his hotel room in the dark. He wouldn't talk to anyone. He didn't want to tour. By the end of the trip, Oscar had perked up somewhat. But Oscar never married as much as he continually and consistently fell in love. Oscar wasn't really a businessman. He was more of an engineer, construction type guy than a business person. So for instance, this is the dock at Appledore, and at the very end, there's a telegraph station. Oscar ran that telegraph station. He also invented and built a washing machine for the hotel that did all the hotel laundry. Up at the cupola of the hotel, Oscar built a telescope so guests could join him in stargazing at night. He also built several projects on the Isles of Shoals. This is his sister Celia's famous cottage with her infamous garden. Oscar built that extension off to the left, expanding both her piazza or porch and the garden itself. He also built this stone cottage on the south shore of Appledore for a cousin of his, Abby, a cottage that's still in existence today. And over on Star Island, at the turn of the century, when a storm knocked down the original wooden bell tower, Oscar rebuilt the tower out of stone. Oscar was a creative soul as well. He painted countless renditions of sailboats and fish. Those were his two favorite subjects for drawing and painting, and they were pretty much the limits of his repertoire. In addition to being an artist, Oscar was a writer. He published privately songs and sonnets, poems about love and the sea, his two favorite things. He edited a collection of his sister Celia's writings in Songs from Appledore, and he wrote the highly entertaining, if not entirely accurate, account of his time at the Isles of Shoals when he was 90 years old, titled 90 Years at the Isles of Shoals. Oscar was published in the Atlantic Monthly a couple times, most notoriously with his poem Clover Blossoms Kiss Her Feet, which in typical Victorian tradition had rhymes. So for instance, my favorite, soft sunshine falls across her breast, she is so blessed. Now, one of the luminaries out on Appledore that used to visit Oscar's sister Celia and attend her salons was John Knowles Payne. He was a frequent visitor. He was a famous organist. He was the first professor of music in the United States at Harvard, and Payne was the first American to ever compose a symphony, first published symphony. So John Knowles Payne actually put Oscar's published poem, Clover Blossoms Kiss Her Feet, to music. And being the generous soul that he truly was, Oscar also let several other composers write music to his poem, Clover Blossoms. Now, I mentioned that Oscar was sort of an engineering building type. He did help run the hotel, however, as did his sister and brother. So Celia handled the reservations for Appledore House, and later helped out a bit with the Oceanic. Celia conducted all the reservation correspondence by hand, and Oscar's younger brother, Cedric, was really the business brain. And just before the turn of the century, both Celia and Cedric died, leaving Oscar to run the two hotels on two of the Isles of Shoals on his own. So for instance, this is a receipt for 504 eggs, which cost $8.40, signed by Oscar Laighton. Shortly after his sister and brother died, the hotel business at the Isles of Shoals died down. There were many more modern seaside hotels with all the latest conveniences, hotels with sports facilities like the Wentworth in Newcastle. And then locally or regionally, the railroad went in between Portsmouth and White Mountains. So the White Mountains became the chic place to vacation, the chic destination. And hotels like the Mount Washington Hotel became quite popular. The hotels at the Isles of Shoals, Appledore House and the Oceanic on Star, were considered dated and kind of run down by the turn of the century. When John Poor sold the Oceanic and Star to the Laighton's, Oscar and Cedric, they took out a mortgage and the bank foreclosed on Oscar and his sister-in-law, Cedric's widow. Very sad. They had overextended themselves in making the purchase of Star Island and the Oceanic, and the bank decided to foreclose on the Appledore mortgage and sell off lots to the public. So this is a map of Appledore, and here you see where Appledore House was. This is what the bank did. They divided Appledore up into 584 lots. They sold 60, about 10% of them. And that accounts for the few remaining private cottages on the south side of Appledore. I call this the subdivision from hell. Oscar moved over to Lunging Island, yet another island that he was to call home at the Shoals. And he built this home, affectionately called the honeymoon cottage, because Oscar had a tradition where he would let newly married couples stay at his cottage on Lunging Island. And the theory was that if they could get along for a week without electricity or running water, their marriage was destined to be successful. Oscar had a plaque put up in his cottage. Welcome to anyone entering the house in shipwreck or in trouble. Start a fire in the stove and make yourself comfortable. There is wood and coal in the shed. You will find matches in the box on the kitchen shelf and food in the cans in the pantry. Beds are made up in the chambers. Help will reach you from the other islands the moment it is possible. The Laighton family was always very generous and thoughtful in general, but especially with those who called the sea their home. Oscar's great grandniece, Celia's granddaughter, Rosamond, on Smutty Nose Island, did a similar thing where her cottage, she put in her will, was to be left unlocked in perpetuity for the safe haven of any stranded mariner. It's just the kind of people they were. And then sadly, in 1914, Appledore Hotel, Appledore House, burned to the ground. This photograph of the fire was taken either by Oscar, who happened to be on Appledore at the time the fire occurred, or by an enterprising reporter. The Portsmouth paper published after the fire, "The end of the old hotel and the historic cottages last Saturday was wholly fitting. The Appledore had already enjoyed its glorious day, and to descend to anything less splendid than its own past would have been a far greater loss than for it to be consumed wholly and necessarily once and for all. The age which made the greatness of the old hotel possible had already passed." kind of heartrending, very poignant, of an era at the Isles of Shoals. But we know the story turns out even better. The fire on Appledore, which burned Appledore House to the ground, must have been absolutely devastating to Oscar. He was able, before his sister Celia's cottage caught on fire and also burned, Oscar was able to run in and save a few things. Now, this we only pieced together a couple of years ago. This is a photograph of Celia's famous parlor where she held her salons with famous writers and musicians and artists. And you'll note this one particular picture on the wall. This picture is hanging in the Star Island Corporation's office in Portsmouth. So we speculate that this was one of the items Oscar was able to rescue from Celia's cottage. It's a wonderful painting, watercolor by Ross Sterling Turner, and has a quote from Oscar's sister, Celia. Now, fortunately for Oscar, things had changed for the better over on Star Island. We talked about this last time, a couple of weeks ago, but Reverend Thomas Elliott and his wife Lila came to Star Island to host the Unitarian summer conferences. Oscar, when he heard about this, the Unitarians were coming and would be staying on Star Island at the Oceanic. Oscar asked, what is a Unitarian? Are they good people? It won't do to introduce any rough element. So the turn of the century was the beginning of the annual summer conferences for Unitarians and Congregationalists, now known as Unitarian Universalists and United Church of Christ. But less than 20 years after those conferences started, just like what happened with Appledore, the bank foreclosed on Star Island and put it up for sale, which set the folks running the conferences on Star into a panic. This property, which can be nowhere duplicated, must be bought at once. And we also, if you were here a couple of weeks ago, know that they were able to raise, they needed $16,000 after the generous down payment put up by Mr. Parkhurst. They raised over $40,000. People felt then about the conferences on Star Island as we feel about them today. Because we know that Star Island was purchased and is held now. Oscar is pictured here with Reverend Elliott. Oscar said, I fear that I never had much religion, but being with these good people fills me with a desire to walk in their footsteps, feeling sure I could not go far wrong. So I guess the Unitarians passed his muster. The Star Island Corporation was incredibly generous to Oscar, probably matching his own generosity. Oscar Laighton was given lifetime room and board on Star Island. Originally in Cottage A, he stayed in room 14, and he had a special door with a shelf at the top so that the waitresses could put Oscar's breakfast tray on the shelf and pass it through without opening the door, so Oscar wouldn't be disturbed by the waitresses. And probably so that, according to rumor, Oscar couldn't disturb the waitresses back. After Oscar grew old enough that climbing the stairs to his room in Cottage A became difficult, he had a room in Cottage C on the ground floor room. Oscar Laighton always wore a blue serge suit, and as often as possible, he had his favorite flower, a bachelor button, which his sister Celia grew in her garden, in his lapel. He had two different boats, the Twilight and the Wild Duck, and he enjoyed giving guests at the Oceanic rides in his boat, preferably when the boat was filled with females. Oscar started driving in his mid-90s. He bought a car in North Carolina where you didn't need a license, and then he came back up here to Portsmouth, where they declined to give him a license because of his age, something he just did not understand. Oscar Laighton died in Portsmouth when he was 99 years and 9 months old. He's buried on Appledore Island in the Laighton family graveyard. Oscar's buried with his sister Celia and his brother Cedric, along with their parents, Thomas and Eliza. Just that nuclear family who had grown so close living on White Island. Oscar had a wonderful last chapter of his life living on Star Island, attending conferences, enjoying talking with the guests, rocking on the porch of the Oceanic. And today, none of us throughout the centuries will ever forget Uncle Oscar Laighton.
Ann, wonderful show. Thank you very much for it. How could Oscar not have known about the Unitarians at that point in the life of Unitarianism in Boston and New England? That seems extraordinary.
My guess would be twofold. One, he led an incredibly sheltered life. He really did not visit the mainland all that often. He stayed out on the shoals. Two, he was quite an advanced age, and it's quite possible that that simply escaped his memory. But that's speculation on my part, because he knew a lot of those ministers. Maybe he just wasn't paying attention.
Well, it's a great quote. I agree.
I love him wondering if the Unitarians were a rough element.
And us so well-bred and educated.
Any other questions or comments?
Ann, Linda Benton.
Linda?
Did he build the cottage on Lunging too? You didn't mention that. Did he build that one? Did he build that one or just the others?
I honestly don't know.
Don't know. Okay.
I can't imagine him not participating.
Right.
Because he also, I mean, he sounds like the kind of guy who could not pass a hammer without picking it up. On a more somber note, he built several of the coffins for people who passed away on Star Island.
Have you ever been in the cottage, the stone cottage that he built?
No. And I've been on Lunging, but I've not been in Honeymoon Cottage either.
There's an interesting, this is Jan Phelps, and there's an interesting question in the chats about asking where he spent his winters.
Oscar, as a younger man, spent his winters on the shoals. Often his family would do that, sort of as caretakers of the cottage. Otherwise, he would go into Portsmouth.
Okay.
He never really ventured far. It's kind of interesting. Taking that trip to Europe must have been quite an adventure for him.
There was a question on how it was properly heated in the winter. Properly is not the right word, probably.
Just how it was heated.
It undoubtedly was impossible to properly heat a home at the Isles of Shoals. Fireplaces were quite common. There were some coal stoves as well. I know the chapel on Star had a coal stove at one point.
So one would assume that those stoves and fireplaces have been removed from the oldest cottages that are still on island, right?
Oscar's room in Cottage C on the main floor still has a fireplace.
Yeah.
in it. Non-functional,
There
but
you
it still has a fireplace. And it's lots of fun. If you're walking around the shoals in less frequented areas, you'll often come across sort of piles of scattered brick. And that usually indicates a place where a fireplace or kitchen once existed.
Oh.
So keep an eye out for
Okay.
loose random bricks.
We've been going here for 50 years. So I wondered about all the brick houses that are there. Stone houses that are there. Were they there when Uncle Oscar was there, or were they built by him?
The parsonage was, yes, the parsonage was built. The current parsonage was built, I believe, just shortly after Oscar died. I don't want to swear to that, but I believe that to be, wait, the parsonage was built in the 1920s. Am I right? Anyone?
That sounds
Parker
right.
was built.
1927.
Thank you.
There you go.
So that would have been 12 years before Uncle Oscar died. So yes, he was familiar with the current parsonage. He also would have been familiar with the former parsonage where his sister and brother-in-law stayed for a year. And Parker, I can't remember when Parker was built, but he would not have seen most of the stone cottages. That was kind of an endeavor that took place a bit after he died, for the most part.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And
Brenda, quit laughing at me.
Oh, you could hear that? Uh-oh.
I told her to mute herself.
Oh dear, I did mute it.
I have a question, Ann.
Yes.
Hi. First of all, this was really interesting. Thank you so much. Interesting that for most of Oscar's life, or maybe all of it, the island was so barren. You know, there weren't trees and bushes. Now, is that because things had all been cut down for firewood, or what?
On Star Island, in particular, they would have cut anything they possibly could. They even dug up some of the sod and burned it. But the other thing is that the shoals have not always had as much vegetation as they do today. And one of the major reasons for that is the gulls, the gull population. Two things. Gulls are federally protected now. They would have been shot as a nuisance in the past. We have laws protecting them now, so their population's expanded. The other thing we humans have done, and I think I talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, we have built the gulls these wonderful buffet restaurants called land pools on the mainland. So that contributes to the health of the population. And with the gulls breeding and nesting on the Isles of Shoals, scientists think that the gull's guano or excrement has contributed to up to 3 inches of topsoil, which let all that vegetation grow.
Wow.
Oh my.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Yes.
Would they have needed the space for the drying racks for the cod in a lot of the places?
Would they have needed the space for the drying racks for the cod? Yes. Flat land, of which there's not that much on the Isles of Shoals, was considered incredibly valuable. And you can see in some of the wills from landowners on the shoals in the late 1600s, 1700s, they would will those little tiny flat parcels of lands very specifically to their firstborn sons. It was prized.
And I have a question.
Yeah,
I cannot quite picture where Lunging Island is. I mean, even though I visited Star Island as a child and as an adult, I can't quite picture where it is.
Lunging's the westernmost of the Isles of Shoals, the one closest to the mainland. So if you're standing on the porch of the Oceanic looking out to the harbor, Lunging would be on your left directly.
Okay, well, I'll take a glance at a map when I get a chance. Thank you. And it's so wonderful. I'm just loving these lectures. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad you enjoy them.
Ann, I've really enjoyed your talks an awful lot. I haven't been to the Isles in about 20 years. I live in Omaha, so it's a little hard to get out there. But my mother and her sister came to the Isles for YRUU conferences before the war. So I'm thinking maybe 1938 or 37. And my mom talked about remembering Uncle Oscar.
Oh,
that's wonderful.
Isn't that cool? She said, oh, he was quite a character, man, and he was quite the attraction, I think.
Yeah.
Awesome. Back
you must have met him at the very end of his life.
Yes. Isn't that interesting?
That is so cool.
That was really neat. And she took all of us to the shoals, so I started going when I was 2 years old. So I have quite a history, and I'd hoped to go this year, but not to happen. So hopefully next year.
Deborah, you will come back.
Yes,
I hope so. I really do.
I have a friend who's in her early 80s now, and her parents started bringing her out to the shoals on their boat when she was an infant. And to keep her stable on the boat, they would put her in a laundry basket. And every year, I suggest that we hold an historical reenactment. And every year, she cusses at me.
Ann, this isn't about Uncle Oscar, but this past week I found out that one of my 10th great grandfathers, named Reverend Thomas Wells, preached at the first chapel. Was in the same place the chapel is today, in 1685.
Wow.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
That's neat.
He wasn't the permanent preacher, but he'd been to Harvard Divinity School, although he didn't graduate, but there were so few preachers then that he ended up in Amesbury, but it just really amazes me.
What was his first name again?
Reverend Thomas Wells.
And do you know what denomination he was in?
I don't. Back then they were all sort of
congregational.
They didn't really.
England or Puritan?
Yeah, I would say Puritan, because if he'd been to I have another relative who was the first president of Harvard, so I'm saying Puritan.
My, yeah.
Wow.
That's going back.
The Shoals fishermen didn't really have a preference for their ministers as to whether they were Puritan or Church of England. They just liked the guy who punished them the least for their sin. Practical people.
Ann?
Yes.
This is Lorraine Giles. We've been to the Shoals to Star for a lot of years. Every time I hear about Lewis Parkhurst, I chuckle because I grew up in Winchester, Massachusetts, where he lived. And I went to the Lewis Parkhurst Elementary School. And I never made that connection until a number of years ago. I was poking around the library at Star and I saw a portrait of someone, a man on a wall. And I said to myself, I have seen that portrait before. And I thought to myself, I looked at who it was and I just gasped. And I said, son of a gun, that same photograph portrait of him was hanging in the lobby of my elementary school. And
That's
so
so funny.
I was born in 1951. So I went to that school from like 56 through whenever I went to junior high school. And I never realized I had that connection. So the other connection in my family with Lewis Parkhurst is my dad, my brother, my stepson, his wife, and a niece, two nieces, all went to Dartmouth. And the administration building at Dartmouth is called Parkhurst, and it's the same Parkhurst. And the way that that word is used colloquially in the Dartmouth community is if you are called into the administration building to be disciplined, and this is still the case, it's calling you're Parkhursted.
So how often were you Parkhursted,
I
Lorraine?
did not go to Dartmouth. Members of my family, but it was one of our nieces who told us about being Parkhursted. So the Parkhurst name just keeps wandering in and through our family.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. I think he was an active member of the Unitarian Church in Winchester, which we went to as small children, and then we switched over to the United Church of Christ there in town. But there's a deep Winchester history. He was a very philanthropic businessman.
We have him to thank for the fact that we still, Star
right.
Island is what it is.
That's exactly right.
You're mentioning Winchester?
Yes.
I'm from Winchester, Virginia, and got out there with Dottie and Ron Cox, very dear friend of mine, and miss Ron a lot. My mother was a pack rat, and she saved all the letters from her husband-to-be. And in one of the letters, it mentioned that her father died. It was 1919, and they went out to Star Island to recuperate. So I actually have in my possession somewhere a postcard of the chapel that they mailed while they were there back to my grandmother. So my goal is to get out to Star Island one way or another, and I did.
That's wonderful.
I just love these programs about Star. We've been going there for 50 years.
Oh.
And there's been so many wonderful people like Fred McGill. Remember Fred McGill?
Yep.
Al Dulo.
Yep.
And there's so many wonderful people that I wish this could continue, and people that knew these wonderful members of Star could have a little history of them too. My husband did is an architect, and he did the cottage, what is the name of the new person that stays all year long on the island?
Oh yeah.
Alex de Steiger, the caretaker.
Yeah, caretaker. So she's in that house, and we always try to get the cottage nearest to that.
So you could look at it.
And we're determined to at least go to Portsmouth, because from a certain place you can see All Star on a nice day. So
great.
look forward to next year.
Hello.
I do wish that there was more of these. It was wonderful hearing about Uncle Oscar.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yes,
Hello,
Ruth.
my name is Ruth Hendry, and I would just like to say hello to Mary Jane and Bill Edwards. I went to I went to Star Island the first time with Bill and Mary Jane, and now my son, who will be 50 soon, at one point he was the captain of the Laighton that took folks out to the Isles of Shoals, and I think he ended up having a nautical career, and it was all based on his experiences at Star Island. So anyway, hi Mary Jane and Bill, and hi Sarah and Aaron.
So nice to see you. You look great.
So we haven't seen each other for like 20 years, so it's nice to say hello. Sorry for interrupting, but and this was just remarkably wonderful.
Yes, yeah.
I'm so glad.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was.
Hi, this is Jackie Trimble Shapiro, and I wanted to share that my son too is nautical and has a nautical career because of Star Island. And I also that Al Doolittle, maybe folks know, is the person who brought the sundial out. And had, so the sundial is thanks to Al Doolittle. I wanted to share that.
So my son and Al Doolittle were great friends, and my son loved to see Al Doolittle's telescope. And one night we sat next to Al Doolittle at dinner. It was lobster night, and we thought we'd be really generous, and we bought my son a lobster dinner, to which he decided he was not interested whatsoever. And rather than, lean over and say, Mom and Dad, would you like my lobster?
Yeah.
He said, Mr. Doolittle, do you want my lobster? And he gave the lobster to Mr. Doolittle, and we never let him forget it.
Generosity of Star Island.
Yes.
Here's another story passing on generations. My son is an astrophysics educator at the Museum of Natural History, the Hayden Planetarium, and it's basically because of Al Doolittle.
Oh, I never knew that, Bob.
Yeah.
Wow. And I don't want to forget Edith Doolittle, who helped to start the gift shop with somebody else whose name's up there. I don't remember, but his beloved wife, they were.
Oh, I remember them both. Ruth Coe did children's childcare during Life on a Star, I believe. I remember having her when I was a wee one. I remember Al and Edith both. I didn't realize that Oscar had the telescope over on Appledore. That was a wonderful picture, Anne. Thank you.
Yeah, he built that.
He built it?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And I was wondering, where did you find that hotel ledger that showed Mr. Poor checking in? Because I had heard that they had all burned, but I guess some of them were on shore somewhere, huh?
Some of them are the property of Star Island Corporation, those that didn't burn.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so there's still some.
Amazing.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. This was absolutely lovely to see you all, and I hope to see you in a couple of weeks.